The thing that we know most clearly about the Messiah is that he'll be a descendant of David. The Messiah has to be a descendant of David. The Christian Bible spends 2 chapters trying to trace the genealogy of Jesus. The first chapter of Matthew, the 3rd chapter of Luke, tries to show that Jesus is a direct descendant of David the king. The problem is that after spending all of this ink trying to show that Jesus descended from David, they shoot themselves in the foot. Why? Because all they really did in Matthew and in Luke is to show that the husband of Mary, his name was Joseph, that Joseph was a descendant of King David. But what does the Christian Bible insist? The Christian Bible insists that Joseph was not the father of Jesus. The Christian Bible insists that Jesus was born to the Virgin Mary, who had no relations with her husband Joseph. Here we have a problem. All they end up doing in Matthew and in Luke is tracing Joseph back to David. But then they say that Joseph was not the father of Jesus. So what happens? They say, well, listen, it's true he wasn't the biological father, but he was the legal father through adoption, that after he finally married Mary, he adopted Jesus as his own son, and now we have Joseph as the legal father through adoption. So we have some problems here. Problem number 1 is that there's no evidence in Judaism or in the Bible that you can pass on your genealogy through adoption. For example, how does someone become a Kohen, a priest? You're a Kohen if your father was a Kohen. There's no evidence at all that if a Kohen adopts a child whose real father was not a Kohen, the kid becomes a Kohen through adoption. That's one problem. But there's a bigger problem. The bigger problem is that even if you could pass on your genealogy through adoption, you can only pass on what you yourself have. For example, if the adoptive parents are on welfare, the kid is not going to grow up in a wealthy family. If the parents are billionaires, the kid's going to be a rich kid. If you go through the genealogy here, the Christian Bible says that this Joseph was a descendant of the king Jeconiah. In English he's called Jeconiah. If you remember, if you studied the book of Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, so the prophet Jeremiah tells us in the 22nd chapter and in the 36th chapter that God cursed this king Jeconiah. He was cursed. And the curse was that none of his descendants could ever sit on the throne of David as king. So if the Christian wants to tell me that Joseph adopted Jesus and then Jesus goes back to King David through his father Joseph, the problem is that Joseph was never qualified to sit on the throne of David as someone who descends from this cursed king Jeconiah. Big problem. So now the Christian turns to us and says, but wait, you find that curse only in the book of Matthew, where in Matthew, Joseph descends from Jeconiah. But if you go to the genealogy in Luke, Luke doesn't mention Jeconiah. So the Christian says to us, you know what? Jesus traces himself back to King David, not through his father, but through his mother Mary. And they say that Mary's genealogy is found in the book of Luke chapter 3. There are 4 problems with this. Problem number 1. If you read the book of Luke chapter 3, it mentions nothing about Mary. It's giving the genealogy of Joseph. Problem number 2. Even if it was giving Mary's genealogy, what do we know about Jewish genealogy? That it goes through the father. What goes through the mother is whether or not the child is Jewish. But what tribe they belong to, it goes through the father. So if a man from tribe A marries a woman from tribe B, the children are A's. And that's why in the first chapter of Numbers of Bamidbar, it says that the Jews traced a tribal affiliation. Lemishbechosam lebeit avotam. Through their families, through their father's household. The genealogy goes through the father. So even if Luke was talking about Mary, and even if you want to say that Mary is the progenitor here of Jesus, she cannot pass on the Davidic genealogy. But let's say she could. So let's say Luke is talking about Mary, and let's say women can pass on the genealogical line. There's another problem. The problem is that the promise that God made to King David, that the Messiah must be a descendant, or any king, David was actually told, any future king has to be a descendant of you, David. David was given that promise by God, that he will be the progenitor of every future king of Israel. The same promise was given to David's son Solomon. So what we call the messianic line, you remember in mathematics, there's a point in algebra, and there's a point, and the line is what describes something that goes through 2 points. So we call the messianic line goes through David and through his son Solomon. So back in the book of Matthew, which we started out with, Matthew explodes on that landmine called Jeconiah. That went from David through Solomon. But over here in Luke, where the missionaries are trying to tell us that Luke is really talking about Mary's genealogy, and Mary can pass on her family line, Luke doesn't go through Solomon, Luke goes through David's son Nathan. So the whole line in Luke is just not the messianic line altogether. The fourth problem, very simple, that the missionary is very happy when the missionary doesn't find Jeconiah, Jechoniah mentioned in Luke's genealogy, but there are only 2 names that Matthew and Luke have in common. By the way, that itself should give everybody the heebie-jeebies. Wait a second. Luke and Matthew are both the genealogy of Jesus, and yet the Luke genealogy and the Matthew genealogy have no names in common except for 2. The names Shealtiel and Zerubbabel, both descendants of Jechoniah. So they're mentioned in Matthew that after Jechoniah comes Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. That's the line that was cursed. And Shealtiel and Zerubbabel are mentioned in Luke as well. So it's quite possible that Luke's genealogy also goes through that cursed line. What we're left with is big problems for the yichus, for the pedigree of Jesus.